They said Marcus Rivera was a liability, a washed-up Special Forces operator whose paranoia had finally caught up with him. 3 months ago, they stripped his security clearance, dismissed him from the intelligence unit, and escorted him off the base like a common criminal. But when unknown hostiles breached the most secure military installation on the eastern seaboard, that same liability became their only hope of survival. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The pre-dawn air at Fort Blackwood carried the weight of autumn rain and diesel exhaust, thick enough to taste on the back of your tongue. Moisture clung to everything: the concrete barriers, the razor wire, the faces of guards who'd been pulling 12-hour shifts for the past month. Steam rose from manholes and storm drains like ghostly fingers reaching toward a sky that hadn't seen clear weather in weeks. The base sprawled across 200 acres of Virginia Piedmont, its buildings hunched against the elements like sleeping giants wrapped in military-grade steel and bureaucratic indifference. Security lights cast harsh pools of white across the vehicle checkpoints, their LED brilliance carving deep shadows between the inspection lanes. The night shift moved with the mechanical precision of people who'd memorized every protocol, every procedure, every acceptable deviation from standard operating procedure. Badge scanners beeped their electronic approval. Barricades rose and fell with hydraulic efficiency. Radio chatter crackled through earpieces with the familiar rhythm of organized boredom until clearance. Sectors clear, all stations report normal. But normal was a fragile concept at Fort Blackwood, especially in the hours before sunrise when the base existed in that liminal space between night watch and morning formation. The installation housed 3 separate commands: the 82nd Intelligence Battalion, the Defense Language Institute's Advanced Training Facility, and a classified research division known only by its bland designation as Administrative Support Unit. 7. What happened behind the triple-fenced perimeter of a Su-7 was the kind of work that required congressional oversight and security clearances that took 18 months to process. Marcus Rivera had possessed that level of clearance once. For 8 years, he'd been the intelligence community's golden boy, a former Green Beret, who'd transitioned seamlessly into the shadowy world of threat assessment and counterintelligence. His service record read like a catalog of conflicts most Americans had never heard of: 3 tours of duty in places that didn't appear on conventional maps, commendations from agencies that didn't officially exist, and a reputation for identifying threats that other analysts missed completely. He'd been the one to flag the Syrian chemical weapons transfers 6 months before they hit the headlines. He'd identified the Pakistani nuclear scientist's affection 3 weeks before the man walked into the American embassy in Islamabad. Marcus possessed that rare combination of street-level experience and analytical intuition that made him invaluable in a profession where being wrong could cost lives and being right could change the course of international relations. That reputation had made his fall from grace all the more spectacular. It started with a threat assessment that contradicted the prevailing intelligence consensus. Marcus had identified patterns in communication intercepts that suggested a coordinated infiltration campaign targeting military installations along the eastern seaboard. His analysis pointed to a sophisticated adversary with intimate knowledge of American security protocols, someone with inside access, training, and patience. The assessment landed on desks throughout the intelligence community like an unwelcome diagnosis. The timing was politically inconvenient. Budget hearings were approaching, and the last thing command needed was another analyst crying wolf about theoretical threats that couldn't be quantified or addressed through conventional channels. Marcus's superiors requested additional evidence. When he couldn't provide satellite imagery or signal intelligence to support his conclusions, they questioned his methodology. When he insisted the threat was imminent, they questioned his judgment. The final blow came during a briefing with Colonel Patricia Hendricks, the base commander whose career had been built on steady competence and political acumen. Marcus had presented his findings with characteristic directness, outlining the vulnerabilities he'd identified and the countermeasures he recommended. Colonel Hendricks listened with the patience of someone who'd heard similar warnings before. When Marcus finished his presentation, she leaned back in her chair and delivered the verdict that would end his career. "Mr. Rivera," she'd said, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, "your analysis is speculative at best and alarmist at worst. We cannot allocate resources based on pattern recognition and intuition. This installation operates according to established security protocols that have proven effective for over 2 decades. I'm recommending that you take some time to recalibrate your analytical approach." The recalibration turned into mandatory psychological evaluation. The evaluation revealed what Marcus's colleagues had whispered about for months: signs of hypervigilance, obsessive pattern recognition, and what the staff psychologist termed persistent threat orientation. In layman's terms, Marcus saw enemies everywhere because he'd spent too many years looking for them. The official diagnosis was occupational stress reaction with paranoid features. The unofficial diagnosis was simpler: Marcus Rivera had cracked under pressure. His security clearance was suspended pending further review. His access to classified systems was terminated immediately. Within a week, he'd been reassigned from threat assessment to administrative duties, filing reports, updating databases, and performing the kinds of tasks typically reserved for junior personnel who'd never held a weapon in anger. The message was clear: Marcus Rivera was no longer trusted with important work. He'd endured the administrative exile for 2 months before the final humiliation arrived in the form of a termination letter. The language was bureaucratically neutral: budget constraints, organizational restructuring, position elimination. But the reality was harsher. Marcus Rivera was being ejected from the intelligence community like a foreign object from a healthy organism. His years of service, his proven track record, his institutional knowledge meant nothing compared to his unwillingness to accept that sometimes threats existed only in the minds of those who looked for them too hard. The dismissal ceremony was conducted with military efficiency and minimum fanfare. Marcus cleaned out his desk under the supervision of security personnel who'd once sought his advice on complex cases. He surrendered his badge, his access cards, and his encrypted communication devices to a clerk who processed his departure like any other routine personnel action. Colonel Hendricks wasn't present for the ceremony. Her aide delivered a brief statement thanking Marcus for his service and wishing him success in his future endeavors. Marcus walked off Fort Blackwood for the last time on a Tuesday afternoon in late summer, carrying a cardboard box containing 8 years' worth of personal effects and a letter of recommendation that praised his dedication while carefully avoiding any mention of his analytical capabilities. The security checkpoint guards who'd known him by name for nearly a decade checked his visitor's badge with professional detachment. The barricades that had risen automatically for his approach now required manual authorization from the guard station. He'd driven away from the base that afternoon with the bitter taste of institutional betrayal coating his throat like smoke from a house fire. The intelligence community had trained him to see threats, rewarded him for identifying patterns, and promoted him for being right when others were wrong. But when his pattern recognition led him to conclusions that challenged comfortable assumptions, that same community had declared his gift a pathology and expelled him accordingly. 3 months later, Marcus Rivera was working private security for a defense contractor in Alexandria, pulling night shifts at office buildings that housed the kinds of government agencies that had once competed for his services. The work was mind-numbing: checking badges, monitoring surveillance feeds, writing incident reports about malfunctioning coffee machines, and unauthorized smoking in designated areas. It paid enough to cover his rent and his daughter's tuition. But it felt like occupational purgatory for someone who'd once briefed senators and cabinet secretaries on matters of national security. The irony wasn't lost on him that while he'd been dismissed for seeing threats that didn't exist, the real threat was methodically preparing to validate every warning he'd tried to deliver. But Marcus Rivera was no longer in a position to warn anyone about anything. He was just another security guard with too much experience and too little authority, watching the world through cameras that showed him everything except what he needed to see. Marcus Rivera sat in his Chevy Tahoe outside the Starbucks on Route 1, nursing his third coffee of the morning and pretending to read the Washington Post, while actually conducting surveillance on a building that officially didn't exist. The Alexandria office complex looked like any other sterile corporate development, glass and steel reaching toward an overcast sky, parking lots filled with late-model sedans, landscaping maintained by contractors who signed non-disclosure agreements before they were allowed to trim the hedges. But Marcus knew better. Behind the innocuous corporate signage for Meridian Consulting Group and Atlantic Research Solutions, the building housed a joint task force responsible for coordinating counterintelligence operations across the Mid-Atlantic region. He'd helped establish the facility during his final year at Fort Blackwood, back when his recommendations carried weight and his threat assessments influenced operational planning. Now he was reduced to watching it from a distance, like an ex-spouse driving past the family home they could no longer afford. The security contract with Blackstone Protection Services paid him $18 an hour to monitor office buildings where junior analysts were probably earning his former salary while lacking a fraction of his experience. The irony was sharp enough to cut glass, but irony didn't pay for his daughter Sophia's college tuition or the therapy sessions she needed after her mother's death 2 years earlier. Marcus adjusted the rearview mirror and caught sight of his own reflection, 43 years old, graying at the temples, with the kind of weathered face that suggested too many years spent in places where comfort was a luxury and paranoia was a survival skill. The crow's feet around his eyes had deepened since his dismissal, etched there by months of restless sleep and the constant low-grade anxiety that came from being professionally discredited. His hands, once steady enough to perform field surgery under fire, now carried a slight tremor that intensified whenever he thought about the warnings he'd tried to deliver. The morning routine was always the same: coffee, newspaper, surveillance of a facility he could no longer enter, followed by a drive to his current assignment, a 12-story office building in Tyson's Corner that housed 3 different defense contractors and a regional office of the Department of Homeland Security. The building's security was competent but unremarkable, the kind of setup designed to deter casual intruders rather than dedicated adversaries with sophisticated capabilities. Marcus parked in his assigned spot and made his way through the employee entrance, nodding to Janet, the day shift supervisor who'd been working corporate security for 15 years without ever needing to know why the elevators to the 8th floor required special key cards or why certain visitors were escorted to meetings. That didn't appear on any official schedule. Janet was good at her job precisely because she understood the boundaries of her curiosity. "Morning, Marcus," she said, handing him the overnight incident report. "Quiet night. Building maintenance replaced the VVAC filters on floors 6 through 9, and we had a false alarm from the motion sensors in the north stairwell around 2:30. Probably another raccoon." Marcus accepted the report and scanned its contents with the thoroughness of someone who'd learned that details other people ignored often contained the information that mattered most. The maintenance report looked routine. Filter replacements were scheduled monthly, and the work orders had been properly authorized. The motion sensor alert was more interesting. Raccoons didn't typically trigger sensors that were calibrated for human-sized movement, and the north stairwell was equipped with infrared detection that could distinguish between different heat signatures. "Did you review the camera footage from the stairwell?" Marcus asked, settling into the security station. Chair that would be his throne for the next 8 hours. Janet shrugged. Checked the feeds, nothing visible. Could be a sensor malfunction, but the system ran diagnostics this morning and everything tested normal. Marcus pulled up the security monitoring software and began his routine review of the overnight footage. 12 floors, 47 cameras, 8 hours of digital recording compressed into a high-speed overview that most guards watched like a silent movie played at triple speed. Marcus watched it frame by frame, the way he'd once analyzed surveillance footage from suspected terrorist safe houses in Kandahar and Mosul. The building hosted a variety of tenants, from the obvious Dynacorp systems whose employees were polo shirts and operated under government contracts, so classified they required separate elevator access to the subtle. The third floor was officially leased to Potomac Strategic Consulting, but Marcus recognized it as a front for a CIA analytical unit that specialized in economic intelligence. The sixth floor housed a satellite office of the Defense Intelligence Agency, disguised as a private think tank called the Institute for Regional Security Studies. What made the building particularly interesting from a counterintelligence perspective was its location. Situated less than 2 miles from CIA headquarters and within easy driving distance of the Pentagon, it served as neutral ground where different agencies could collaborate without the territorial complications that plagued more official facilities. Marcus had attended briefings in this building back when his security clearance granted him access to the kinds of meetings where cabinet-level decisions were shaped by analyses like the ones he used to write. The overnight footage revealed the usual patterns. Late-night cleaning crews moved through the offices with practiced efficiency, their movements tracked by sensors that recorded everything from their entry times to their biometric signatures. The security guards made their rounds with clockwork precision, checking doors, testing alarms, and ensuring that sensitive areas remained properly secured. Nothing appeared unusual, which was exactly what bothered Marcus. During his years in special operations, he'd learned to trust his instincts, especially when logic suggested he was being paranoid. The human brain was capable of processing thousands of subtle environmental cues below the threshold of conscious awareness, synthesizing patterns that couldn't be articulated, but nevertheless represented genuine insights. Marcus had built his reputation on the ability to sense when something was wrong before he could explain why something was wrong now. He could feel it in the way the overnight maintenance crew had moved through their assignments, too purposeful, too familiar with the building's layout for workers who were supposedly temporary contractors. He could see it in the slight delay between the motion sensor alert and the corresponding camera activation, a gap of perhaps 3 seconds that suggested either equipment malfunction or deliberate interference. Most troubling was what wasn't in the footage, any evidence of the raccoon that had supposedly triggered the alert. Marcus opened the building's personnel database and cross-referenced the maintenance crew against their employment records. 3-man team had been contracted through Facility Solutions, Inc., a Virginia-based company that provided maintenance services to government facilities throughout the region. Their background checks had been processed through standard channels. Their supervisor had the appropriate security clearances, and their work orders had been properly authorized by building management. But Marcus had learned to look beyond the surface of official documentation. He accessed the company's corporate filings and discovered that Facility Solutions, Inc. had been established 18 months earlier, coinciding almost exactly with the timeline he'd identified in his dismissed threat assessment. The company's listed address was a strip mall office that also housed a tax preparation service and a chiropractor's office. Their client list included 7 different government facilities, all of which had been identified in Marcus's analysis as potential targets for infiltration. The pattern was elegant in its simplicity. A maintenance company with legitimate contracts and proper credentials could access sensitive facilities without triggering the security protocols designed to detect hostile surveillance. Their employees could map building layouts, identify security weaknesses, and establish the intelligence foundation necessary for more sophisticated operations. The beauty of the approach was that it operated entirely within legal boundaries until the moment it didn single quotes t. Marcus reached for his secure phone, then stopped. Who would he call? Colonel Hendricks, who dismissed his analysis as paranoid speculation. The FBI counterintelligence unit that had reviewed his findings and concluded they lacked sufficient evidence for further investigation. The CIA security office that had politely thanked him for his concerns while filing his report in what was undoubtedly a bureaucratic dead-letter file. He was no longer Marcus Rivera, senior intelligence analyst with direct access to decision-makers and the authority to initiate protective measures. He was Marcus Rivera, a security guard with a history of mental health issues and a reputation for seeing threats that existed only in his imagination. His warnings carried no more weight than those of any other civilian with theories about government, conspiracies, and foreign infiltration. The realization settled over him like a heavy blanket, smothering the adrenaline that had begun to surge through his system. He was professionally isolated, institutionally discredited, and personally powerless to act on information that his former colleagues would dismiss as the delusions of a man who'd spent too many years looking for enemies in the shadows. But the enemies were there, whether anyone believed him or not. They were there in the maintenance records, in the motion sensor alerts, in the 3-second delay between detection and confirmation. They were methodically mapping the facilities they intended to target, identifying the vulnerabilities they intended to exploit, and preparing for operations that would validate every warning Marcus had tried to deliver. He sat back in his chair and stared at the security monitors, watching. The building's daytime tenants arrived for another routine day of classified work. They moved through their morning rituals with the confidence of people who believed their security was someone else's responsibility, trusting in systems and protocols that Marcus knew were already compromised. The coffee in his cup had grown cold, but he didn't notice. His attention was focused entirely on the screens before him, searching for patterns that others would miss, analyzing threats that others would dismiss, and preparing for a confrontation that others refused to believe was coming. The anomaly appeared on Marcus's screen at 2:17 a.m. on a Thursday night, when the building should have been empty except for the overnight cleaning crew and the automated systems that never slept. A brief thermal signature registered on the 8th floor, the restricted level that housed the Department of Homeland Security's Regional Counterterrorism Unit. The heat bloom lasted exactly 4 seconds before disappearing, but it was enough to trigger an alert that most security guards would have dismissed as a sensor glitch. Marcus wasn't most security guards. He immediately pulled up the corresponding camera feeds and began scrubbing through the footage frame by frame. The 8th floor cameras showed nothing unusual: empty corridors lined with office doors bearing generic nameplates, fluorescent lighting casting the sterile glow of after-hours government bureaucracy. But the thermal sensor didn't lie, and 4 seconds was too long for electronic interference or equipment malfunction. He expanded his search to include the building's environmental systems, checking air circulation patterns, temperature differentials, and HAVOC operational logs. The data painted a picture that made his pulse quicken. The building's heating system had registered a brief spike in thermal load on the 8th floor at exactly 2:17 a.m., followed by an equally brief drop in air pressure that suggested a door or window had been opened and quickly closed. Someone had been on the 8th floor. Someone who knew how to move through the building without triggering the motion sensors. Someone who understood the camera placement well enough to avoid visual detection, but who couldn't mask the heat signature that every living body produced. It was the kind of sophisticated infiltration that required intimate knowledge of the building's security systems, the kind of knowledge that maintenance contractors would possess after months of legitimate access. Marcus reached for the secure Phone that connected directly to the building's command center, then hesitated. The overnight supervisor was Tom Bradley, a 20-year veteran of corporate security who'd earned his reputation through steady competence and strict adherence to established protocols. Tom was good at his job, but his job didn't include believing conspiracy theories from disgraced intelligence analysts who'd been demoted to entry-level security work. Instead, Marcus accessed the building's visitor log and cross-referenced it against the evening's activity reports. The cleaning crew had badged out at 1:45 a.m., 32 minutes before the thermal anomaly. No other personnel were scheduled to be in the building overnight. The DHS offices were equipped with their own independent security systems that would have recorded any authorized access, but Marcus didn't have the clearance level necessary to review those logs. He pulled up the building's perimeter cameras and began examining the exterior footage from the past 6 hours. The parking lots were empty except for a few vehicles belonging to employees who'd worked late, a common occurrence in a building that housed analysts working on global time zones. But one vehicle caught his attention, a white Ford Transit van. Parked in the visitor section that hadn't been there during his previous patrol check at midnight, the van was unremarkable in every way that mattered. Standard commercial vehicle, Virginia plates, no visible markings or identifying features. It was the kind of vehicle that maintenance crews used to transport equipment, delivery services used for overnight cargo runs, that government contractors use for discreet transportation of sensitive materials. It was also the perfect surveillance platform for someone who wanted to monitor the building. Without attracting attention, Marcus zoomed in on the van's license plate and ran it through the database. The registration came back to a leasing company in Arlington that specialized in providing vehicles to government contractors and corporate clients. The company's client list was protected under confidentiality agreements, but Marcus recognized the address. It was the same building that housed 3 other companies he'd identified as potential fronts during his dismissed threat assessment. Pattern was becoming clearer with each piece of information he uncovered. A sophisticated adversary had spent months, possibly years, establishing the infrastructure necessary for sustained intelligence operations against American government facilities. They'd created legitimate businesses, obtained proper credentials, and built the kind of operational foundation that could support activities far beyond simple surveillance. Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had once accompanied his most important discoveries, the moment when disparate pieces of information suddenly aligned to reveal a hidden threat. But the adrenaline was accompanied by an equally familiar sense of isolation. He was the only person in the building who understood what he was seeing, and his warnings would carry no more weight than those of any other security guard reporting suspicious activity. He tried calling Tom Bradley's direct line, knowing that the conversation would be recorded and that his concerns would be documented in the overnight incident report. Tom answered on the 3rd ring, his voice carrying the patient weariness of someone who'd fielded countless false alarms from nervous security guards. "What's the situation, Rivera?" Tom asked, and Marcus could hear him shuffling through paperwork in the background. "I've got a thermal anomaly on the 8th floor at 2:17 a.m., Marcus said, keeping his voice level and professional. No corresponding visual confirmation, but the environmental systems show temperature and pressure changes consistent with human presence. There was a pause while Tom accessed the relevant systems from his own terminal. "I'm showing normal readings across all floors," he said finally. "Thermal sensors are operating within normal parameters, and I don't see any alerts in the system logs." "The alert cleared automatically after 4 seconds, Marcus explained. "But the environmental data supports the thermal reading. Someone was on that floor." "The cleaning crew badged out at 1:45, Tom replied, and Marcus could hear the skepticism creeping into his voice. DHS personnel would have used their own access protocols, which would show up in their independent logs. "Are you suggesting we've got an authorized intrusion?" Marcus chose his words carefully. "I'm suggesting we've got an anomaly that warrants investigation. The thermal signature, the environmental changes, and the presence of an unregistered vehicle in the visitor parking section all indicate potential security concerns." "What vehicle?" Tom asked, and Marcus could hear him pulling up the perimeter camera feeds. "White Ford Transit van, Virginia plates Charlie Delta 7429. It wasn't there during the midnight patrol, and it's not registered with building management." Tom was quiet for nearly a minute while he reviewed the footage. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from skeptical to cautious. "I see the van. No movement around it on the cameras, no record of anyone badging into the building after the cleaning crew left. Could be someone working late who forgot to register their visitor." "At 2:17 a.m., Marcus asked, "with thermal signatures on a restricted floor and no visual confirmation on any camera system." "Rivera," Tom said, and his voice carried the weight of institutional authority, "I understand your background gives you a different perspective on security matters, but we can't initiate emergency protocols based on sensor readings that could have a dozen different explanations. I'll make a note in the overnight report and recommend that day shift management review the footage." The dismissal was polite, but final. Tom Bradley wasn't going to authorize a floor-by-floor search based on the concerns of a security guard with a documented history of paranoid behavior. The system was working exactly as it had been designed to filter out false alarms and prevent overreaction to ambiguous threats. Marcus ended the call and stared at his monitors, watching the empty corridors and parking lots that contained evidence of an intrusion that no one else would acknowledge. He'd followed proper protocols, reported his concerns through appropriate channels, and been dismissed by a supervisor who lacked the context necessary to understand what he was seeing. But understanding what he was seeing and being able to act on that understanding were different things entirely. Marcus Rivera was no longer in a position to initiate protective measures, coordinate with other agencies, or authorize the kind of comprehensive investigation that the situation demanded. He was a security guard with above-average analytical skills and a reputation for seeing threats that existed only in his imagination. The white van remained in the visitor parking section, its occupants, if any, invisible to the camera systems that were supposed to provide comprehensive coverage of the building's perimeter. The 8th floor remained quiet, its secrets protected by classification levels that Marcus no longer possessed. The thermal anomaly had been logged, reported, and dismissed as a sensor malfunction that didn't warrant further investigation. Marcus opened his personal laptop and began documenting everything he'd observed, creating a record that would exist independently of the official incident reports that might be buried or explained away. He captured screenshots of the thermal readings, the environmental data, the vehicle registration information, and the timeline of events that painted a picture of sophisticated surveillance operations targeting American government facilities. The documentation was more than professional habit, it was insurance. When the real attack came, when the sophisticated adversary finally moved beyond surveillance to direct action, Marcus wanted there to be a record of his warnings. He wanted investigators to know that someone had seen the threat developing, have tried to sound the alarm, and had been ignored by institutions that mistook paranoia for prudence. Outside, the white van sat motionless in the pre-dawn darkness, its presence a constant reminder that enemies operated with patience, planning, and the kind of professional competence that government bureaucracies were poorly equipped to detect or counter. Marcus Rivera watched it through cameras that revealed nothing while knowing everything. A dismissed intelligence analyst reduced to bearing witness to threats that others refused to see. The night shift stretched ahead of him. 8 more hours of monitoring systems that recorded everything except what mattered most. The morning briefing at Fort Blackwood commenced at 0800 hours with the mechanical precision that defined military routine. Colonel Patricia Hendricks stood at the head of the conference table, her uniform crisp despite the early hour, addressing the assembled department heads with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to managing multiple crises simultaneously. The overhead projector displayed a map of the eastern seaboard, dotted with red markers indicating military installations, intelligence facilities, and critical infrastructure sites. "Gentlemen, ladies," Colonel Hendricks began, her voice carrying the authority that came from 23 years of military service. "We've received intelligence reports suggesting increased surveillance activity targeting government facilities in the region. The FBI's Counterintelligence Division has identified patterns of suspicious behavior around defense contractors, research facilities, and military installations." Major Robert Chun, the base intelligence officer, leaned forward slightly. His tablet displayed a series of incident reports from the past month, each documenting minor security anomalies that individually appeared insignificant but collectively suggested coordinated reconnaissance efforts. "Ma'am, the pattern analysis indicates sophisticated adversaries with detailed knowledge of our security protocols. The surveillance appears designed to map vulnerabilities rather than gather specific intelligence." Colonel Hendricks nodded, advancing to the next slide. "Which brings us to our primary concern. ASU-7 houses research projects that represent significant national security assets. The work being conducted in that facility cannot be compromised under any circumstances. I want security protocols reviewed, access lists updated, and all personnel subjected to enhanced screening procedures." Captain Lisa Rodriguez from the Military Police Battalion raised her hand. "Colonel, what about the civilian contractors? The maintenance crews, food service personnel, and technical support staff represent potential security vulnerabilities. They have routine access to areas that could provide intelligence value to hostile actors. All contractor personnel have been subject to standard background investigations," replied Major Chen. "Their security clearances are current, and their work is supervised by cleared military personnel. The FBI has found no evidence of compromise among authorized contractor staff. The dismissal was automatic, bureaucratic, and completely predictable." Marcus Rivera had sat through similar briefings hundreds of times during his tenure at Fort Blackwood, watching competent professionals analyze threats through the lens of established procedures while missing the sophisticated adversaries who operated entirely within those same procedures. The system was designed to detect obvious threats, foreign agents with suspicious backgrounds, personnel with financial vulnerabilities, contractors with questionable associations. It wasn't designed to identify enemies who had spent years building legitimate credentials specifically to defeat those detection methods. Colonel Hendricks continued her briefing, outlining enhanced security measures that included additional guard rotations, expanded camera coverage, and more frequent inspections of sensitive areas. The measures were reasonable, professional, and completely inadequate to address the threat that Marcus had identified 3 months earlier. They were reactive rather than preventive, addressing symptoms rather than causes, and they demonstrated the fundamental limitation of institutional thinking when confronted with unconventional threats. "I want daily reports on all security incidents, regardless of how minor they might appear," Colonel Hendricks instructed. "Pattern recognition is crucial in counterintelligence operations. What appears insignificant in isolation may reveal hostile intent when viewed as part of a larger campaign." The irony was sharp enough to cut steel. Pattern recognition had been Marcus Rivera's specialty, the analytical skill that had made him invaluable to the intelligence community and ultimately led to his professional destruction. He had identified the patterns that Colonel Hendricks was now instructing her staff to look for, but his analysis had been dismissed as paranoid speculation because it contradicted comfortable assumptions about American security. Major Chun pulled up another slide showing the timeline of suspicious activities. The incidents appear to follow a geographic pattern, moving from south to north along the I-95 corridor. Naval Station Norfolk reported unusual maintenance requests last month. Quantico documented sensor malfunctions in sensitive areas 2 weeks ago. Joint Base Andrews identified anomalous vehicle activity in their perimeter zones last week. What about Fort Blackwood? Asked Captain Rodriguez. Have we experienced similar incidents? Major Chun consulted his tablet. Nothing significant. Minor equipment malfunctions, routine maintenance activities, standard false alarms from environmental sensors. Our security systems appear to be functioning normally. The response demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical blindness that Marcus had warned about. Security systems were functioning normally because the threat had been designed to operate within normal parameters. The sophisticated adversaries weren't triggering alarms or leaving obvious evidence of their activities. They were methodically mapping vulnerabilities through legitimate access, patient observation, and the kind of long-term intelligence operations that American security protocols were poorly equipped to detect. Colonel Hendricks advanced to the final slide, which displayed a photograph of the ASU-7 facility, a nondescript concrete building surrounded by additional fencing and guarded by personnel whose security clearances required presidential approval. This facility represents our highest priority. The research being conducted here has strategic implications that extend far beyond regional security concerns. I want personal assurance from each department that your security measures are adequate to protect against sophisticated threats. The assurances came automatically, professionally, and with complete confidence. The military police would increase patrol frequencies around sensitive areas. The intelligence battalion would enhance their threat monitoring capabilities. The facility security team would implement additional access controls and surveillance measures. Each department head spoke with the conviction of professionals who believed their systems were adequate to handle any conceivable threat. But Marcus Rivera had learned that the most dangerous threats were often the inconceivable ones, the adversaries who approached problems from angles that security planners hadn't anticipated, who exploited vulnerabilities that existed in the gaps between established procedures. The enemy he had identified didn't fit the conventional threat model because it had been specifically designed to operate outside conventional detection methods. The briefing concluded with the standard reminders about operational security, proper reporting procedures, and the importance of maintaining vigilance without compromising operational efficiency. Colonel Hendricks dismissed her staff with instructions to implement the enhanced security measures within 48 hours and to report any unusual incidents immediately, regardless of how insignificant they might appear. As the department heads filed out of the conference room, discussing implementation schedules and resource requirements, none of them mentioned Marcus Rivera or the threat assessment that had cost him his career. His analysis had been buried so thoroughly that it no longer existed in the institutional memory of Fort Blackwood. The warnings he had tried to deliver, the patterns he had identified, the recommendations he had made, all of it had been erased, as completely as if it had never existed. Meanwhile, 15 miles away in Tyson's Corner, Marcus sat at his security station watching camera feeds that showed no sign of the white van that had occupied the visitor parking section for the past week. The vehicle had disappeared sometime during the previous night's shift change, vanishing as quietly as it had appeared. No one had badged into the building to retrieve it. No towing company had been called to remove it. It had simply vanished, leaving behind only digital records that most security guards wouldn't think to preserve. But Marcus preserved everything. His personal documentation now included photographs of the van, copies of its registration information, timestamps of its arrival and departure, and detailed analysis of the correlation between its presence and the various security anomalies he had detected throughout the building. The documentation painted a clear picture of systematic surveillance operations, but it was evidence that would never be seen by the people who needed to understand its implications. The phone on his desk rang at exactly 0930 hours, interrupting his review of the overnight incident reports. The caller ID showed an internal extension from the building management office, and Marcus recognized the voice of Director Patricia Walsh, the senior administrator responsible for coordinating tenant security requirements. "Mr. Rivera," she said, her tone professionally neutral, "I've reviewed your incident reports from the past week. You've documented several minor anomalies that our maintenance staff has been unable to reproduce or explain. I'm concerned that these reports might reflect equipment sensitivity issues rather than actual security concerns." The criticism was diplomatically phrased but unmistakably clear. Marcus's reports were being characterized as false alarms generated by oversensitive equipment or overzealous analysis. The implication was that he was seeing threats that didn't exist, a pattern of behavior that his personnel file had already documented during his tenure at Fort Blackwood. "Ma'am," Marcus replied carefully, "the anomalies I've documented are consistent with sophisticated surveillance operations. The thermal signatures, environmental changes, and vehicle activities suggest coordinated intelligence gathering by adversaries with detailed knowledge of building security systems." "Mr. Rivera," Director Walsh said, and her voice carried the patience of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult employees, "I understand that your previous experience gives you a unique perspective on security matters. However, this is a corporate office building, not a military installation. Our security requirements are focused on preventing unauthorized access and protecting tenant property, not defending against foreign intelligence operations." The dismissal was complete and final. Marcus Rivera's analysis was being rejected not because it was inaccurate, but because it was inconvenient. The building's security protocols were designed to handle conventional threats, burglars, vandals, disgruntled employees, not sophisticated adversaries conducting intelligence operations against government facilities. His warnings didn't fit the threat model that corporate security was equipped to address, so they were being dismissed as evidence of paranoid thinking rather than professional insight. Marcus ended the call and returned to his monitors, watching empty corridors and parking lots that contained no visible evidence of the threats he knew were present. The white van was gone, but the intelligence it had gathered remained. The thermal anomalies had been explained away as equipment malfunctions, but the mapping they had enabled was complete. The patterns he had identified were dismissed as coincidence, but the adversaries who had created those patterns were moving to the next phase of operations that would validate every warning he had tried to deliver. At 0347 hours on a moonless Tuesday morning, Marcus Rivera made the decision that would either vindicate 8 years of counterintelligence expertise or destroy what remained of his professional reputation. The security monitors in front of him displayed feeds from the Tyson's Corner building, where he'd spent the past 3 months documenting threats that everyone else refused to acknowledge. But tonight was different. Tonight, the patterns he'd been tracking were converging into something that demanded immediate action, regardless of the personal consequences. The first indicator came through his encrypted scanner, a police frequency that most security guards wouldn't have known existed, much less monitored. 3 units were responding to a suspicious vehicle incident near the Potomac Strategic Consulting Building, the CIA front operation that Marcus had identified during his original threat assessment. The reported vehicle matched the description of the white van that had disappeared from his building the previous week. Marcus pulled up his personal threat matrix, a comprehensive analysis he'd been developing during his off-duty hours. The document contained over 200 pages of intelligence correlations, pattern analysis, and operational assessments that painted a picture of coordinated attacks being prepared against multiple government facilities simultaneously. What made tonight different was the temporal clustering. Multiple elements of the threat infrastructure were activating within the same 4-hour window. His secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from a contact he hadn't heard from in 18 months. Tommy Nakamura had been his partner during 2 deployments in Afghanistan, a special forces communications specialist who'd transitioned into private intelligence work after leaving the Army. The message was brief and unsigned. Echo patterns. Active. Multiple sites. Time window is narrow. Trust your instincts. Marcus understood the coded reference immediately. Echo patterns was their term for the sophisticated infiltration signatures they'd identified while tracking Taliban intelligence networks in Kandahar province. The enemy would establish legitimate access to target areas, conduct patient surveillance over extended periods, then coordinate simultaneous strikes designed to overwhelm defensive responses. It was the same methodology Marcus had identified in his dismissed threat assessment, now being validated by someone whose analytical skills he trusted completely. He opened his laptop and accessed the building's environmental control system. Using administrative credentials that technically exceeded his authorization level but which hadn't been revoked when his security duties were downgraded. The system showed atmospheric pressure fluctuations on multiple floors that indicated rapid movement through areas that should have been empty. The thermal sensors were registering brief heat signatures in locations where his official patrols wouldn't detect them for another 40 minutes. Someone was inside the building. Multiple individuals moving with the kind of operational discipline that suggested military or intelligence training. They were using the maintenance access routes that Marcus had identified as vulnerability points, following paths that avoided primary camera coverage while exploiting the blind spots that existed between overlapping sensor fields. Marcus reached for the emergency notification system, then stopped. Protocol required him to contact Tom Bradley first, to follow the chain of command that would delay any response until the threats had completed whatever operation they were conducting. He'd already learned what happened when he reported anomalies. Through official channels, dismissal, documentation of paranoid behavior, and professional isolation that prevented him from protecting the facilities he'd sworn to defend. Instead, he activated his personal communication array, a collection of encrypted devices that connected him directly to former colleagues who still possessed the clearance levels and institutional authority necessary to respond to imminent threats. The first call went to Sarah Chun at the Defense Intelligence Agency, his former supervisor who'd been forced to sign off on his dismissal despite her private doubts about the decision. Marcus? Sarah's voice carried the grogginess of someone awakened at 04:00 hours, but also the instant alertness of an intelligence professional who understood that emergency calls didn't respect normal business hours. "Sarah, I need you to listen carefully," Marcus said, keeping his voice low while monitoring the building's security feeds. "The threats I identified in my final assessment are executing coordinated operations tonight. Multiple government facilities are being penetrated simultaneously by adversaries using the infrastructure I mapped 3 months ago." There was a pause while Sarah processed the implications. "Marcus, I can't authorize protective actions based on I'm sending you real-time data," Marcus interrupted. Uploading the environmental readings and thermal signatures to a secure server they'd established during their previous collaboration. Building penetration is active at my current location. Similar patterns are manifesting at sites throughout the region. This isn't theoretical analysis, it's operational intelligence. Sarah was quiet for nearly 30 seconds while she accessed the data through her encrypted terminal. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted from skeptical to concerned. "These readings are consistent with sophisticated infiltration operations. How certain are you about the coordination?" 95%, Marcus replied, watching new thermal signatures appear on floors that his rounds wouldn't reach for another hour. "The temporal clustering, the methodology, the target selection, everything matches the operational framework I identified. They're using tonight's weather conditions to mask their heat signatures, and they've timed the operations to coincide with shift changes at multiple facilities. I need official confirmation before I can initiate protective protocols, Sarah sighed, and Marcus could hear her accessing secure communication systems in the background. Can you provide visual confirmation of hostile personnel? Marcus checked his camera feeds again, seeing nothing but empty corridors and vacant offices. That masked the presence of intruders who understood exactly how to move through monitored spaces without triggering visual detection. Negative on visual confirmation, but the environmental data is conclusive. They're here, Sarah. Multiple personnel conducting intelligence operations against government facilities. I'm initiating preliminary alerts to affected installations, Sarah said. But Marcus, if you're wrong about this, if these are false alarms generated by equipment, malfunctions or analytical errors, the consequences for your credibility will be permanent. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Marcus understood the warning perfectly. He was risking not just his current employment, but any possibility of future work in the intelligence community. If the threats he was reporting turned out to be shadows and sensor glitches, he would be permanently branded as a paranoid former analyst, whose judgment couldn't be trusted under any circumstances. But the alternative was allowing sophisticated adversaries to complete operations that could compromise national security assets and endanger the lives of intelligence personnel who trusted that their security was adequate to protect them. Marcus had spent 8 years learning to make decisions under uncertainty, to act on incomplete information when the consequences of inaction exceeded the risks of being wrong. Sarah, I'm initiating protective measures at my current location, Marcus said, already moving toward the emergency response protocols that his training had embedded in muscle memory. Whether I'm right or wrong, I can't stand by and watch while potential threats operate against American facilities. He ended the call and activated the building's comprehensive alarm system, triggering security protocols that would seal access points, activate emergency lighting, and notify law enforcement agencies of a potential security breach. The decision was irreversible within minutes. His actions would be recorded in official incident reports that would either validate his analysis or provide final evidence of his psychological instability. The alarm system activated with a piercing electronic wail that echoed through empty corridors and vacant offices. Emergency lights bathed the building in harsh red illumination that eliminated the shadows where intruders might hide. Automated security barriers descended to seal primary access points, trapping anyone inside the building until law enforcement could respond. Marcus's radio crackled with Tom Bradley's voice, sharp with confusion and authority. Rivera, what the hell is happening? I'm showing comprehensive alarm activation at your location with no corresponding alerts from monitoring systems. Multiple intruders confirmed through environmental sensors, Marcus replied, moving through the building with the tactical awareness that 10 years of special operations had ingrained in his reflexes. Thermal signatures on floors 4, 6, and 8. Coordinated penetration using maintenance access routes. Law enforcement has been notified. Rivera, I need you to shut down that alarm system immediately, Tom ordered. You don't have authorization to initiate comprehensive security protocols based on sensor readings that could have equipment-related explanations. Marcus ignored the order and continued his sweep of the building's perimeter, checking access points that his official duties never required him to monitor. The emergency lighting revealed evidence that trained eyes could interpret scuff marks on stairwell doors that indicated recent use, subtle displacement of security equipment that suggested tampering, atmospheric pressure differentials that confirmed his environmental readings. His phone buzzed with another encrypted message from Tommy Nakamura, Federal Response Teams mobilizing. Multiple confirmations of coordinated operations. Your pattern analysis was accurate. Hold position until backup arrives. The validation was professionally satisfying but personally irrelevant. Marcus Rivera was no longer conducting this operation to prove the accuracy of his analysis or to restore his damaged reputation. He was protecting American intelligence assets from sophisticated adversaries who had spent months preparing for this moment, using his skills and experience to compensate for institutional failures that had left government facilities vulnerable to coordinated attack. The building's security systems continued their electronic symphony of alerts and automated responses, broadcasting Marcus's decision to act without authorization to every law enforcement agency in the region. By sunrise, his actions would either be recognized as the decisive intervention that prevented a significant intelligence breach, or documented as the final evidence that Marcus Rivera's paranoid delusions had made him a danger to the facilities he was supposed to protect. But as he moved through corridors illuminated by emergency lighting, following thermal traces that led to intruders who possessed the skills and equipment necessary to penetrate American government facilities, Marcus Rivera knew that he had made the only choice his training and conscience would allow. The first hostile emerged from the 6th-floor stairwell at 04:02 hours, moving with the fluid precision of someone trained in military close-quarters operations. Marcus observed him through the emergency lighting's harsh red glow medium height. Dark tactical clothing, night vision equipment pushed up on his forehead, and the controlled breathing pattern of a professional who'd been caught off guard by an alarm system that wasn't supposed to activate. Marcus positioned himself behind the security station's reinforced barrier, his service weapon drawn but held low, finger indexed along the trigger guard in the combat-ready position that muscle memory had preserved despite 3 months of civilian security work. The intruder was approximately 30 meters away, scanning the corridor with the methodical pattern of someone trained to clear hostile environments under stress. The man's equipment told a story that validated every element of Marcus's threat assessment. Commercial climbing gear for accessing building exteriors, electronic devices for defeating lock mechanisms, compact cameras for documenting sensitive areas, and communication equipment that suggested coordination with external support teams. This wasn't random criminal activity, it was sophisticated intelligence collection conducted by adversaries with military-grade capabilities and extensive operational planning. Marcus keyed his radio to the emergency frequency that connected directly to federal law enforcement agencies. "This is Rivera at the Tyson's Corner facility. I have visual confirmation of an armed intruder on floor 6. Subject is equipped for technical intelligence operations and appears to be part of a coordinated breach team, requesting immediate tactical response." The response came from Special Agent Jennifer Walsh of the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, her voice crackling through the encrypted channel with the authority of someone accustomed to managing complex security incidents. "Rivera, we're tracking multiple alarm activations throughout the region. Federal response teams are en route to your location. Maintain visual contact but do not engage unless directly threatened." Through his peripheral vision, Marcus detected movement on the 4th-floor thermal signatures that indicated at least 2 additional intruders operating in areas that housed classified research contracts and defense intelligence analysis units. The coordination was sophisticated, with each team targeting different aspects of the building's intelligence infrastructure while maintaining communication discipline that suggested extensive operational training. The hostile on the 6th floor had reached the primary corridor intersection, where security cameras would normally provide comprehensive coverage of anyone attempting to access restricted areas. But the emergency lighting had activated infrared suppression, protocols designed to prevent surveillance equipment from being compromised by excessive brightness, creating blind spots that trained operatives could exploit. Marcus activated his personal recording device, documenting everything he observed through methods that existed outside official security protocols. The footage would provide federal investigators with evidence of the intruder's capabilities, equipment, and operational procedures intelligence that could be crucial for identifying the organization responsible for the coordinated attacks. Intruder's radio crackled with a brief transmission in what sounded like Eastern European language, possibly Russian or Ukrainian, though the audio quality made precise identification difficult. The response came in accented English. Abort sequence initiated. Primary objective secured. Execute withdrawal protocols. The order triggered immediate movement throughout the building. Marcus watched thermal signatures converge on predetermined egress points, suggesting that the intruders had pre-planned extraction routes that would minimize their exposure to responding law enforcement agencies. Their operational discipline was impressive. No panic, no confusion, just professional execution of contingency plans that had probably been rehearsed extensively. Marcus moved to intercept the sixth-floor hostel's withdrawal route, using his knowledge of the building's layout to position himself at a choke point that the intruder would have to pass. His approach was tactical rather than confrontational. He wanted intelligence about the operation's scope and objectives, not necessarily to engage in combat with professionally trained adversaries. The intruder rounded the corner at exactly the moment Marcus had calculated, bringing them face to face in the corridor's red-lit intersection. Both men froze for a heartbeat, evaluating threats and tactical options with the split-second assessment that combat training had embedded in their reflexes. Marcus kept his weapon lowered but ready, his voice calm and professionally neutral. Federal agents are responding. Your team needs to surrender immediately to avoid escalation. The intruder's response was immediate and telling. He reached for a device clipped to his tactical vest, probably a deadman switch or emergency beacon that would alert external support teams to his capture. The movement was instinctive, suggesting that these operatives had been trained to prioritize operational security over personal safety. "Don't," Marcus said, allowing his weapon to rise slightly while maintaining non-threatening body language. "You're outnumbered and surrounded. Smart play is cooperation, not escalation." The hostil's eyes flicked to Marcus's security uniform, then to his weapon handling, then to his tactical positioning. Professional recognition passed between them, the acknowledgement that both men possessed similar training and understood the dynamics of the confrontation they were navigating. "You are not regular security," the intruder said, his English heavily accented but grammatically precise. "Military background. Special operations, perhaps intelligence." Marcus nodded slightly. "Former Green Beret, current counterintelligence analyst. Your operation has been compromised from the beginning. We've been tracking your infrastructure for months." The lie was calculated to gather information about the adversary's operational assumptions and to potentially discourage future operations by suggesting that American intelligence capabilities were more comprehensive than they actually were. The intruder's reaction would provide valuable insights into his training, his operational security protocols, and his assessment of American defensive capabilities. "Impossible," the host replied, but his voice carried the uncertainty of someone whose assumptions about operational security were being challenged. "Our procedures are designed to avoid detection by your agencies." "Your procedures are good," Marcus acknowledged. "Military-grade planning, sophisticated equipment, excellent. Operational discipline. But you made one critical error. You assumed that American security protocols are limited to official channels and institutional responses." The intruder's radio crackled with another transmission, this time urgent and demanding. External support. Teams were probably monitoring police frequencies and had detected federal law enforcement mobilization throughout the region. The coordinated nature of the response would be telling them that their operations had been anticipated and countered by intelligence agencies with comprehensive understanding of their methods. Marcus continued his psychological pressure, using techniques he'd learned during interrogation training to gather intelligence while maintaining tactical advantage. Your maintenance company fronts, your vehicle surveillance, your facility mapping, We documented all of it. The question is whether you're going to cooperate with federal investigators, or whether you're going to make this more difficult for everyone involved." The hostile's hand moved away from the device on his vest, a subtle indication that he was reconsidering his tactical options. Professional operatives were trained to evaluate risk-benefit calculations under stress, and the combination of law enforcement response, operational compromise, and tactical disadvantage was probably exceeding his threshold for acceptable mission. Risk. "My government will deny any knowledge of these operations," he said, providing confirmation that Marcus was dealing with state-sponsored intelligence activities rather than freelance criminal enterprises. "Your government's denials are irrelevant," Marcus replied. "What matters is whether you personally want to spend the next 20 years in federal prison, or whether you want to have conversations with people who might be interested in mutually beneficial arrangements." The psychological leverage was working. The intruder was a professional who understood that capture by American intelligence agencies could lead to either lengthy imprisonment or potential cooperation agreements, depending on his willingness to provide information about his handlers, his training, and the broader intelligence operations that had targeted American facilities. Sirens echoed through the building's exterior as federal response teams arrived at multiple access points. The coordinated law enforcement response would be overwhelming FBI counterintelligence specialists, military police from nearby installations, and possibly CIA security teams if the facilities contained assets that warranted their involvement. Marcus's radio crackled with updates from the Tactical Command Center that had been established to coordinate the multi-agency response. Similar confrontations were occurring at government facilities throughout the region, with multiple arrests of foreign operatives conducting intelligence operations against American defense contractors and military installations. The validation was professionally satisfying but strategically concerning. The scope of the coordinated attack suggested that hostile intelligence services had invested significant resources in mapping American security vulnerabilities, indicating that tonight's operations were probably preliminary to larger intelligence campaigns designed to compromise critical national security assets. The intruder on the 6th floor raised his hand slowly, acknowledging tactical reality and making the professional calculation that cooperation offered better long-term prospects than resistance. His surrender was the first piece of intelligence that would help federal agencies understand the full scope of the threat that Marcus Rivera had identified 3 months earlier, when his warnings had been dismissed as paranoid speculation by institutions that mistook analytical competence for psychological instability. As federal agents flooded into the building to secure the scene and process the captured operatives, Marcus Rivera remained at his security station, documenting everything he'd observed and preparing the comprehensive intelligence reports that would finally validate his professional judgment, while revealing the extent of foreign intelligence operations against American government facilities. The tactical debrief commenced at 0630 hours in a secure conference room at the FBI's Washington field office, with Marcus Rivera seated at a table surrounded by federal agents whose expressions ranged from professional curiosity to barely concealed amazement. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh led the session, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 15 years managing counterintelligence operations that rarely produced such comprehensive results. "Mr. Rivera," she began, consulting a tablet that displayed preliminary intelligence gathered from the captured operatives, "your actions last night prevented what appears to have been the largest coordinated intelligence breach in recent memory. 7 government facilities were simultaneously penetrated by foreign operatives, using methodologies that closely match your dismissed threat assessment from 3 months ago. The room contained representatives from multiple agencies: FBI counterintelligence, Defense Intelligence Agency, CIA security, and military intelligence officers whose clearance levels allowed them to understand the full scope of what had been prevented. Each of them had read Marcus's original analysis, the same document that had been dismissed as paranoid. Speculation by Colonel Hendricks and her staff at Fort Blackwood. Agent Walsh activated the conference room secure display system, showing a map of the eastern seaboard marked with red indicators at each facility that had been targeted. The operatives captured at your location have provided preliminary information suggesting that these operations were coordinated by a foreign intelligence service with extensive resources and long-term planning capabilities. The infrastructure. They established legitimate businesses, qualified personnel. Proper credentials represents a multi-million-dollar investment in penetrating American security. Major Robert Chun from the Defense Intelligence Agency leaned forward, his expression reflecting the kind of professional embarrassment that came from dismissing accurate intelligence analysis. Mr. Rivera, your original assessment identified this threat with remarkable precision. The maintenance company fronts, the vehicle surveillance patterns, the facility mapping activities, everything you documented has been confirmed through interrogation of captured personnel. Marcus nodded, feeling none of the vindication he'd expected after months of professional isolation and institutional dismissal. The validation was important, but it came at the cost of demonstrating that American security protocols were inadequate to detect sophisticated adversaries who operated within legal boundaries until the moment they crossed into hostile action. The operatives were tasked with gathering intelligence on classified research projects, personnel information, and facility vulnerabilities, Agent Walsh continued. Their equipment included advanced technical surveillance devices, computer, network penetration tools, and communication systems that would have allowed them to exfiltrate massive amounts of sensitive information. Captain Sarah Chun from the Defense Intelligence Agency, who had been forced to sign off on Marcus's dismissal despite her private reservations, spoke with the careful precision of someone whose professional judgment had been proven catastrophically wrong. The captured personnel have identified similar operations being planned against facilities throughout the United States. Your pattern recognition prevented not just last night's breaches, but potentially dozens of future intelligence operations. The scope of the threat was staggering. Foreign adversaries had spent years establishing the operational infrastructure necessary to systematically compromise American government facilities, using legitimate business fronts and qualified personnel to defeat security measures that were designed to detect obvious threats rather than sophisticated ones. Marcus's analysis had identified the threat accurately, but institutional biases had prevented decision-makers from recognizing its validity. Agent Walsh pulled up another slide showing photographs of equipment recovered from the captured operatives. The technical capabilities demonstrated by these personnel suggest state-level sponsorship and extensive training. The surveillance devices could penetrate classified computer networks. The communication equipment could coordinate operations across multiple time zones, and the documentation methods could have compromised ongoing intelligence operations worldwide. Marcus studied the equipment photographs, recognizing several items that matched his theoretical assessments of capabilities that hostile intelligence services would need to penetrate American facilities effectively. The validation was professionally satisfying but strategically disturbing. It meant that his worst-case scenarios had been accurate, and that American security had been compromised more extensively than anyone had realized. Mr. Rivera said. Colonel Patricia Hendricks, who had entered the conference room during the equipment briefing, her presence commanding immediate attention from everyone present. Her expression reflected the kind of institutional humility that came from making decisions that endangered national security through administrative convenience rather than analytical rigor. Colonel, Marcus replied, maintaining the professional courtesy that military protocol demanded despite the personal cost of her previous decisions. Your analysis was correct, she said simply. My rejection of your assessment was based on political considerations rather than intelligence merit. The threat you identified was real, sophisticated, and imminent. Your warnings could have prevented months of hostile intelligence gathering if I had possessed the professional courage to act on analytical conclusions that challenged comfortable assumptions. The admission was remarkable for its directness and its implications. Colonel Hendricks was acknowledging that institutional biases had compromised national security, that political considerations had been prioritized over intelligence analysis, and that Marcus Rivera's professional judgment had been superior to that of the decision-makers who had dismissed his warnings. Agent Walsh advanced to the next phase of the briefing, displaying interrogation transcripts from the captured operatives. The foreign personnel have provided information about training facilities, operational planning, and long-term objectives that extend far beyond simple intelligence gathering. Their handlers were preparing for operations that could have disrupted critical military communications, compromised ongoing intelligence operations, and endangered the lives of American personnel worldwide. The implications were sobering. The threat that Marcus had identified wasn't limited to surveillance and intelligence gathering. It was preliminary to more aggressive operations that could have caused significant damage to American national security interests. His pattern recognition had detected the early stages of a comprehensive campaign designed to systematically compromise American defensive capabilities. Major Chun consulted his own notes before addressing the room. The captured equipment includes network penetration tools that could have accessed classified databases, communication intercept devices that could have monitored secure military frequencies, and documentation systems that could have compromised the identities of intelligence personnel operating under diplomatic cover worldwide. Marcus felt the weight of institutional vindication settling over him like a heavy blanket. Every element of his dismissed threat assessment had been proven accurate through the capture of hostile operatives whose capabilities exceeded even his worst-case projections. The validation was complete, but it came at the cost of demonstrating that American security had been penetrated more extensively than anyone had been willing to acknowledge. The question now, Agent Walsh said, looking directly at Marcus, is how we prevent similar operations in the future. Your analytical methods identified threats that our conventional security protocols missed entirely. We need to understand how your pattern recognition worked so that we can integrate similar capabilities into our defensive planning. The request represented a fundamental shift in institutional thinking. Instead of dismissing unconventional analysis as paranoid speculation, federal agencies were now seeking to understand and replicate the methodologies that had proven superior to established intelligence protocols. Marcus Rivera was being asked to help redesign American security procedures based on lessons learned from his professional exile and eventual vindication. The key is understanding that sophisticated adversaries don't operate outside our security protocols, Marcus explained. They operate within them, using legitimate credentials and established procedures to defeat detection methods that focus on obvious threats rather than subtle ones. Pattern recognition requires looking for anomalies that appear normal individually, but reveal hostile intent when viewed collectively. Colonel Hendricks took notes as Marcus spoke, documenting insights that could reshape how military installations approached counterintelligence and threat assessment. Your methodology identified vulnerabilities that we hadn't considered because they existed in the intersection between different security systems rather than within individual protocols. The debrief continued for another 2 hours, with Marcus providing detailed explanations of his analytical methods, threat assessment, procedures, and pattern recognition techniques that could be adapted for use by other intelligence professionals. The captured operatives had provided confirmation of foreign intelligence capabilities that exceeded American defensive planning, making Marcus's insights crucial for developing countermeasures that could prevent future breaches. As the session concluded, Agent Walsh addressed the institutional failures that had nearly prevented Marcus from acting on his analysis. Your warnings were dismissed because they challenged assumptions about American security that were comfortable but inaccurate. The lesson for our agencies is that analytical accuracy matters more than institutional convenience, and that unconventional threats require unconventional thinking. Marcus Rivera had been proven right about everything: the threat, the methodology, the timeline, and the scope of hostile operations against American facilities. But the validation came at the cost of demonstrating that institutional biases could compromise national security when decision-makers prioritize political considerations over intelligence analysis. His professional exile had ended, but the larger questions about American security capabilities remained troubling and unresolved. The captured operatives represented only the beginning of a comprehensive investigation that would reveal the full extent of foreign intelligence operations against American government facilities. Validating Marcus Rivera's expertise while raising disturbing questions about institutional competence in protecting national security assets. The secure phone call came at 0800 hours sharp, 3 days after the coordinated arrests with Marcus Rivera, still processing the professional whiplash of transitioning from dismissed security guard to essential intelligence asset. Director James Harrison of the Defense Intelligence Agency spoke with the measured authority of someone whose career had been built on managing complex operations, but his voice carried an undertone of institutional humility that Marcus had never heard from senior leadership. "Mr. Rivera," Director Harrison began, "I'm calling to inform you that your security clearance has been fully restored, with additional special access authorizations that reflect the critical nature of your recent contributions to national security. More importantly, I'm offering you a position as Senior Threat Assessment Analyst with my personal staff, reporting directly to me on matters of strategic counterintelligence." The offer represented complete professional rehabilitation, but Marcus understood that it came with implications that extended far beyond personal vindication. His analysis had exposed systematic vulnerabilities in American security protocols, and his new role would involve redesigning those protocols to address threats that conventional thinking had been unable to detect. "Director, I appreciate the offer," Marcus replied, "but I need to understand the scope of the position. Are we talking about reactive analysis of known threats, or proactive identification of hostile operations that haven't yet been detected through conventional channels?" "The latter," Harrison confirmed. "Your pattern recognition capabilities have proven superior to our institutional methods. We need you to develop analytical frameworks that can identify sophisticated adversaries before they complete their operational preparations. You'll have access to intelligence sources across the federal government, with authority to initiate protective measures when you identify imminent threats." The authority being offered was remarkable, essentially carte blanche to conduct threat assessment operations with minimal bureaucratic oversight. It represented the kind of institutional trust that Marcus had never possessed during his previous tenure with the intelligence community, but it also carried responsibility for preventing the kinds of security breaches that his recent analysis had barely stopped. Within hours of accepting the position, Marcus found himself in a secure facility in Northern Virginia, surrounded by analysts and technicians who were implementing his methodologies across multiple government agencies. The workspace resembled a high-tech war room, with wall-mounted displays showing real-time intelligence feeds from facilities throughout the United States, all being processed through analytical frameworks that Marcus had developed during his months of professional exile. Dr. Elizabeth Carter, the CIA's chief of counterintelligence analysis, briefed him on the scope of the threat that his initial warnings had uncovered. "The captured operatives have provided intelligence about a comprehensive campaign that targeted over 40 government facilities nationwide. The Foreign Intelligence Service responsible for the operations had invested approximately $50 million in establishing legitimate business fronts and training personnel for long-term penetration missions. The scale was staggering. What Marcus had identified as pattern anomalies in maintenance contracts and vehicle surveillance had been preliminary to intelligence operations that could have compromised classified research projects, endangered intelligence personnel, and provided hostile nations with detailed knowledge of American defensive capabilities. The most concerning aspect, Dr. Carter continued, is that our conventional security protocols detected none of this activity. The adversaries operated entirely within legal boundaries, using legitimate credentials and established procedures to gather intelligence that could have been used for everything from targeted recruitment of government personnel to planning direct attacks on critical infrastructure. Marcus studied the intelligence summaries while processing the implications of what American security agencies had failed to detect. The foreign operatives had spent 3 years establishing their operational infrastructure, during which time they had conducted surveillance of dozens of facilities, mapped security vulnerabilities, and identified personnel who could be targeted for recruitment or coercion. "What's our current assessment of ongoing threats?" Marcus asked, already beginning to identify patterns in the intelligence reports that suggested the captured operatives represented only one element of a larger campaign. Major Sarah Chun, who had been reassigned to Marcus's analytical team after the vindication of his original assessment, pulled up a classified database that contained threat indicators from the past 6 months. "We're tracking suspicious activities at government facilities in 12 different states. The patterns match the methodologies used by the captured operatives, suggesting that similar operations are being conducted by teams that weren't involved in the coordinated breach attempts." The news was troubling, but not surprising. Sophisticated intelligence operations typically involved multiple independent cells operating under separate command structures, ensuring that the capture of one team wouldn't compromise ongoing operations. Marcus's pattern recognition had identified one aspect of a comprehensive campaign that probably extended far beyond what they had detected so far. "I need access to maintenance contracts, vehicle registration databases, and facility access logs for every government installation that houses classified operations," Marcus said, already formulating the analytical approach that could identify hostile operations before they reached the execution phase. Within 24 hours, Marcus was working with data streams that represented the most comprehensive intelligence picture he'd ever been given access to. The analytical tools at his disposal included artificial intelligence systems that could process millions of data points simultaneously, pattern recognition software that could identify anomalies across multiple agencies and communication intercept, capabilities that could monitor potential threats in real time. The preliminary results were disturbing. Marcus identified at least 15 ongoing operations that matched the methodologies used by the captured foreign operatives. Spread across facilities from California to Maine, the adversaries had adapted their techniques based on American security responses, developing new approaches that exploited different vulnerabilities while maintaining the same strategic objectives. "Director Harrison," Marcus said during their daily briefing call, "the threat is more extensive than our initial assessment indicated. We're dealing with a systematic campaign that has been in development for at least 5 years, with operational capabilities that exceed anything we've documented in recent counterintelligence operations." Harrison's response reflected the institutional concern that came from discovering that American security had been compromised more extensively than anyone had realized. "What do you need to address the ongoing threats?" "Authority to coordinate protective measures across multiple agencies," Marcus replied. "The adversaries are operating against facilities managed by different departments, using approaches that exploit jurisdictional boundaries and information-sharing limitations. We need response capabilities that can match the scope and sophistication of the threat." The authority was granted within hours, giving Marcus unprecedented access to security resources across the federal government. His analytical team expanded to include specialists from the FBI, CIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and National Security Agency, all working under his direction to identify and counter hostile intelligence operations that conventional security protocols had been unable to detect. The vindication was complete, but it came with sobering recognition of how extensively American security had been penetrated by adversaries whose capabilities had been underestimated by institutional thinking. Marcus Rivera had been proven right about everything: the threat, the methodology, the scope, and the urgency, but the validation revealed vulnerabilities that extended far beyond what anyone had been prepared to acknowledge. Agent Jennifer Walsh summarized the institutional implications during a secure conference call with senior leadership from across the intelligence community. Mr. Rivera's analysis has demonstrated that our conventional security protocols are inadequate to address sophisticated adversaries who operate within legal boundaries while preparing hostile operations. We need fundamental changes in how we approach counterintelligence and threat assessment. The changes were already being implemented. Marcus's analytical frameworks were being adopted by security agencies throughout the federal government. His pattern recognition techniques were being taught to intelligence analysts at every classification level, and his threat assessment methodologies were being integrated into security protocols at facilities nationwide. But the professional vindication came with personal recognition of how close American security had come to catastrophic compromise. The foreign operatives captured during the coordinated breach attempts had been weeks away from completing intelligence operations that could have endangered ongoing military operations, compromised intelligence personnel, and provided hostile nations with capabilities to disrupt American defensive systems. Colonel Patricia Hendricks visited Marcus's analytical facility to personally apologize for the institutional failures that had nearly prevented him from acting on his warnings. Your analysis was accurate, your warnings were justified, and your persistence in the face of professional dismissal probably prevented security breaches that could have had strategic implications for American national security. Marcus accepted the apology while understanding that institutional vindication couldn't undo the months of professional exile he'd endured, or guarantee that similar analytical insights wouldn't be dismissed in the future when they challenged comfortable assumptions about American security capabilities. The quiet recognition he received from his colleagues was more meaningful than official commendations or institutional apologies. Federal agents who had initially been skeptical of his warnings now sought his guidance on complex cases. Intelligence analysts who had dismissed his pattern recognition techniques now requested training in his methodologies. Military officers who had questioned his threat assessments now deferred to his expertise on matters of strategic counterintelligence. Marcus Rivera had become what the intelligence community had always claimed to value but rarely actually supported: an analyst whose unconventional thinking could identify threats that institutional methods missed, whose willingness to challenge established assumptions could prevent security breaches that conventional wisdom couldn't detect. 6 months after the coordinated arrests, Marcus Rivera stood before an audience of intelligence professionals at the National Defense University, delivering a classified briefing that would fundamentally reshape how American security agencies approached threat assessment and counterintelligence operations. The auditorium contained senior analysts from every major intelligence organization, military officers responsible for installation security, and civilian contractors whose facilities housed sensitive government operations. The Rivera Protocol, as his analytical framework had been designated by the Defense Intelligence Agency, was now being implemented at over 200 government facilities nationwide. The methodology had already identified 17 additional hostile intelligence operations, prevented 12 attempted security breaches, and led to the arrest of 34 foreign operatives who had been conducting surveillance activities that conventional security measures had failed to detect. But the broader implications of Marcus's work extended far beyond individual successes. His analysis had exposed systematic weaknesses in American security, thinking that had made government facilities vulnerable to adversaries who understood how to exploit bureaucratic assumptions and institutional blind spots. The changes being implemented represented the most comprehensive revision of counterintelligence protocols since the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security. Dr. Elizabeth Carter from the CIA introduced Marcus to the audience with words that reflected the institutional humility that his vindication had forced upon the intelligence community. Mr. Rivera's analysis demonstrated that our greatest security vulnerabilities existed not in our technology or our procedures, but in our willingness to dismiss threats that didn't conform to established threat models. His work has saved American lives and protected national security assets that we didn't even realize were at risk. Marcus began his presentation with the intelligence picture that his expanded analytical capabilities had uncovered during the previous 6 months. The coordinated attacks that had been prevented in October represented only the initial phase of a comprehensive campaign that extended across 4 different foreign intelligence services, involved over 200 trained operatives, and had targeted critical infrastructure systems throughout the United States. The adversaries we're confronting possess capabilities that exceed our previous assessments of foreign intelligence operations, Marcus explained, displaying classified photographs of equipment recovered from captured operatives. They've invested years in understanding American security protocols, identifying bureaucratic vulnerabilities, and developing operational methods specifically designed to defeat our detection capabilities. The evidence was overwhelming. Foreign intelligence services had established legitimate businesses in 43 states, trained personnel in American security procedures, and created operational infrastructure that could support intelligence activities for decades without detection. The scope of the threat had exceeded every worst-case scenario that American security agencies had developed for planning purposes. Colonel Patricia Hendricks, who had been reassigned to oversee implementation of the Rivera Protocol at military installations, addressed the institutional failures that had nearly prevented Marcus from acting on his original warnings. We dismissed accurate intelligence analysis because it challenged assumptions that were comfortable but wrong. The lesson for our community is that analytical accuracy must take precedence over institutional convenience, regardless of the political implications. The changes being implemented were comprehensive. Military installations were revising their contractor vetting procedures to include the kind of pattern analysis that Marcus had developed. Intelligence agencies were establishing new channels for reporting anomalous activities that existed outside conventional threat categories. Federal law enforcement agencies were creating joint task forces specifically designed to investigate sophisticated intelligence operations that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. Agent Jennifer Walsh from the FBI's Counterintelligence Division provided updates on the ongoing investigation of foreign intelligence networks that Marcus's analysis had uncovered. We've identified operational cells in 17 major metropolitan areas, all using variations of the methodologies that Mr. Rivera detected through his pattern recognition work. The arrests made possible by his analysis have disrupted intelligence operations that threatened facilities from the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory to the Centers for Disease Control. The scope of the threat had been staggering. Foreign adversaries had been systematically mapping American government facilities, identifying personnel vulnerabilities, and preparing operational capabilities that could have been used for everything from industrial espionage to direct attacks on critical infrastructure. Marcus's warnings had prevented security breaches that could have compromised decades of scientific research and endangered thousands of government employees. Major Sarah Chun, who now served as Marcus's deputy in the newly established Strategic Threat Assessment Division, outlined the international implications of the foreign intelligence operations that had been uncovered. The captured operatives have provided information about training facilities in Eastern Europe, operational planning centers in Southeast Asia, and command structures that suggest state-level coordination of intelligence activities against American targets. The intelligence gathered from arrested foreign operatives had revealed connections between seemingly unrelated security incidents dating back over 5 years. What American agencies had categorized as isolated criminal activities or equipment malfunctions had actually been elements of coordinated intelligence operations conducted by adversaries who possessed detailed knowledge of American security procedures and bureaucratic limitations. The most concerning aspect of these operations, Marcus continued, is that they were designed to remain undetected until the moment of execution. The adversaries weren't gathering intelligence for immediate use. They were building comprehensive target packages for future operations that could have had strategic implications for American national security. The audience included intelligence professionals who had spent decades in counterintelligence work, but Marcus's briefing revealed threats that exceeded their previous understanding of foreign intelligence capabilities. The adversaries had demonstrated patience, sophistication, and resources that suggested intelligence operations were being conducted at a scale and intensity that American security agencies had been unprepared to detect or counter. Dr. Robert Harrison, the Defense Intelligence Agency director who had restored Marcus's security clearance, addressed the institutional changes that his analysis had made necessary. The Rivera Protocol represents more than new analytical methods. It represents a fundamental shift in how we think about threats and our responsibility to identify them before they manifest as actual security breaches. The protocol was being taught at intelligence training facilities throughout the federal government, incorporated into security procedures at sensitive installations, and shared with allied nations whose facilities face similar threats from sophisticated adversaries. Marcus's pattern recognition techniques were becoming standard elements of counterintelligence analysis. His threat assessment methodologies were being adapted for different operational environments, and his willingness to challenge institutional assumptions was being held up as a model for analytical independence. But the personal cost of his vindication remained significant. Marcus had spent months in professional exile, dismissed by colleagues who had questioned his judgment and superiors, who had prioritized political considerations over intelligence analysis. The validation of his warnings had come at the expense of demonstrating that American security had been more extensively compromised than anyone had been willing to acknowledge. The standing ovation that concluded his briefing reflected more than professional recognition. It represented institutional acknowledgement that conventional thinking had failed to protect American interests against sophisticated adversaries who understood how to exploit bureaucratic blind spots and administrative assumptions. Marcus Rivera had been proven right about everything, but his vindication had revealed vulnerabilities that extended far beyond what anyone had been prepared to confront. During the classified discussion session that followed his presentation, intelligence professionals from across the federal government sought his guidance on implementing similar analytical approaches within their own organizations. The questions reflected genuine institutional interest in learning from methodologies that had proven superior to established intelligence protocols. The key insight, Marcus explained during the discussion, is that sophisticated adversaries don't operate outside our security systems. They operate within them, using legitimate credentials and established procedures to defeat detection methods that focus on obvious threats rather than subtle ones. Effective counterintelligence requires looking for patterns that appear normal individually but reveal hostile intent when viewed collectively. The discussion continued for 2 hours, with Marcus providing detailed explanations of analytical techniques that could be adapted for different operational environments and threat scenarios. The intelligence professionals in attendance were documenting insights that would reshape how American security agencies approach their most fundamental responsibilities, protecting government facilities and personnel from adversaries whose Capabilities exceeded conventional threat assessments. As the briefing concluded, Marcus reflected on the professional journey that had taken him from dismissed security guard to senior intelligence analyst whose methodologies were being implemented throughout the federal government. The vindication was complete, but it had come at the cost of revealing that American security had been penetrated more extensively than institutional thinking had been able to recognize or address. The foreign intelligence operations that his analysis had uncovered represented only the beginning of a comprehensive investigation that would reveal the full scope of hostile activities against American government facilities. Marcus Rivera had become the analyst whose unconventional thinking could identify threats that conventional wisdom missed, whose persistence in the face of institutional dismissal had prevented security breaches with strategic implications for national security. His warnings had been validated, his methods had been adopted, and his analysis had fundamentally changed how American intelligence agencies understood and responded to sophisticated threats. But the larger questions about institutional competence and bureaucratic accountability remained troubling reminders of how close American security had come to catastrophic compromise 2 years after the coordinated intelligence breach that had nearly compromised American national security. Marcus Rivera received a call that would define the legacy of his analytical work and institutional vindication. The secure line connected him directly to the Oval Office, where President Elizabeth Morrison was reviewing intelligence assessments that bore his signature and carried implications for American foreign policy at the highest levels. "Mr. Rivera," the president said, her voice carrying the weight of decisions that affected millions of lives, "your threat assessment regarding coordinated infrastructure attacks has been validated by intelligence sources across 3 different agencies. The foreign adversaries you identified 2 years ago are now planning operations that could disrupt power grids, communication networks, and transportation systems across multiple states simultaneously." The conversation represented the ultimate vindication of Marcus's analytical approach, but it also confirmed his most troubling predictions about the scope and sophistication of threats facing American national security. The foreign intelligence operations he had initially detected through maintenance, contract anomalies, and vehicle surveillance patterns had evolved into comprehensive campaigns, targeting the infrastructure systems that modern society depended upon for basic functioning. Marcus had spent the previous 18 months developing analytical frameworks that could identify hostile operations against critical infrastructure, working with specialists from the Department of Energy, Transportation, Security Administration, and Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. His pattern recognition techniques had uncovered evidence of systematic reconnaissance activities targeting electrical substations, communication hubs, water treatment facilities, and transportation networks throughout the United States. "Madam President," Marcus replied, "the intelligence indicates that we're facing adversaries who have spent years mapping our infrastructure vulnerabilities, identifying single points of failure, and developing operational capabilities to exploit those weaknesses simultaneously. The coordination required for such operations suggests state-level sponsorship with resources that exceed anything we've documented in previous threat assessments." The briefing materials that Marcus had prepared for presidential review contained intelligence gathered from over 300 separate investigations, each stemming from analytical techniques that had been dismissed as paranoid speculation during his initial warnings about government facility penetrations. The foreign adversaries had demonstrated patience, sophistication, and strategic planning that challenged every assumption American security agencies had made about the scope of threats facing critical infrastructure. President Morrison's National Security Advisor, General Patricia Walsh, joined the secure call to discuss operational implications of Marcus's latest threat assessment. "Mr. Rivera, your analysis suggests that the adversaries are prepared to conduct coordinated attacks that could affect over 40 million Americans simultaneously. The economic implications alone could destabilize global markets, while the social disruption could create conditions that would take months or years to restore. The assessment was accurate but understated. Marcus's analysis had identified potential attack scenarios that could cascade through interconnected infrastructure systems, creating failures that would compound exponentially as each disrupted system affected others. The adversaries had demonstrated understanding of American infrastructure dependencies that exceeded the knowledge possessed by most government agencies responsible for protecting those same systems. The most concerning aspect, Marcus explained, is that the adversaries are positioning assets for operations that appear designed to create maximum psychological impact rather than strategic military advantage. They're targeting systems that affect civilian populations directly: electrical power, water supplies, communication networks, and transportation systems that people depend upon for daily life. The implications were staggering. Foreign intelligence services had invested years in developing capabilities to conduct attacks that would demonstrate American vulnerability to hostile action while avoiding the kind of direct military confrontation that would trigger conventional defensive responses. The operations that Marcus had identified were designed to create terror, economic disruption, and social instability rather than traditional military objectives. During the secure video conference that followed the initial call, Marcus briefed senior government officials on the scope of the threat that his expanded analytical capabilities had uncovered. The audience included cabinet secretaries, military commanders, intelligence directors, and congressional leaders whose decisions would determine how American society prepared for and responded to sophisticated attacks on critical infrastructure. The foreign operatives we've identified possess detailed knowledge of American infrastructure systems, including information about backup procedures, emergency protocols, and restoration capabilities, Marcus reported. Their operational planning suggests that they've calculated not just how to disrupt our systems, but how to prevent rapid recovery from those disruptions. The intelligence picture was comprehensive and terrifying. Foreign adversaries had infiltrated contractors responsible for maintaining critical infrastructure, gathered detailed information about system vulnerabilities, and positioned operational assets that could be activated with minimal warning to conduct coordinated attacks across multiple time zones simultaneously. Secretary of Homeland Security Michael Chun addressed the institutional changes that Marcus's work had made necessary throughout the federal government. Mr. Rivera's analytical methods have identified threats that our conventional security protocols were unable to detect. We've implemented his frameworks across every critical infrastructure sector, but the adversaries have demonstrated adaptive capabilities that suggest they're modifying their approaches based on our defensive measures. The cat-and-mouse dynamic was exactly what Marcus had predicted during his original threat assessments. Sophisticated adversaries would adapt their methodologies based on American defensive responses, developing new approaches that exploited different vulnerabilities while maintaining the same strategic objectives. The challenge for American security agencies was staying ahead of adversaries who possessed the patience and resources necessary for multi-year operational planning. CIA Director Sarah Harrison provided updates on international intelligence cooperation that had resulted from Marcus's analysis. Mr. Rivera's threat assessments have been shared with allied nations whose infrastructure faces similar vulnerabilities. We've identified parallel operations being conducted against European electrical grids, Asian communication networks, and global financial systems. The scope suggests coordinated international campaigns designed to demonstrate Western vulnerability to infrastructure attacks. The global implications were sobering. The foreign intelligence operations that Marcus had initially detected through pattern analysis of American government facilities had been elements of comprehensive campaigns targeting democratic nations worldwide. The adversaries possessed capabilities and intentions that exceeded regional threats, representing challenges to international stability that required coordinated responses across traditional alliance structures. Marcus's daughter Sophia, now completing her master's degree in international relations, had written her thesis on the intelligence failures that had nearly prevented her father from acting on his original warnings. Her research had been classified at the highest levels, but it provided insights into institutional dynamics that could prevent future analytical blind spots from compromising national security. The academic analysis confirms what we've learned. Operationally, Marcus explained during his briefing to senior officials, institutional biases toward comfortable assumptions represent our greatest vulnerability to sophisticated adversaries who understand how to exploit bureaucratic limitations and administrative blind spots. The lesson had been learned at enormous cost, but it was being implemented throughout American security agencies with the kind of institutional commitment that came from narrowly avoiding catastrophic intelligence failures. Marcus's analytical frameworks were being taught at every level of government. His threat assessment methodologies were being adapted for international cooperation, and his willingness to challenge established assumptions was being institutionalized through structural changes in how intelligence agencies operated. President Morrison concluded the briefing session with instructions that reflected the gravity of threats that Marcus's analysis had uncovered. Mr. Rivera's work has demonstrated that American national security depends upon our willingness to identify and respond to threats that challenge our assumptions about adversary capabilities and intentions. His analytical methods will be implemented across every relevant government agency, with authority to initiate protective measures when imminent threats are identified. The authority being granted was unprecedented, essentially recognition that Marcus Rivera's judgment on matters of strategic threat assessment was superior to institutional decision-making processes that had nearly prevented him from acting on intelligence that proved crucial for national security. His vindication was complete, but it had come at the cost of revealing vulnerabilities that extended far beyond what anyone had been prepared to acknowledge. The foreign intelligence operations that Marcus had uncovered through pattern recognition and analytical persistence represented the most sophisticated threats American security agencies had ever documented. The adversaries possessed capabilities that exceeded every previous assessment of hostile intelligence operations, demonstrated strategic patience that challenged conventional deterrence calculations, and showed willingness to conduct attacks that could affect millions of civilian lives. Marcus Rivera had become the intelligence analyst whose unconventional thinking could identify existential threats that institutional wisdom missed, whose professional exile had been transformed into institutional recognition that his methods were essential for protecting American national security. His warnings had been validated at every level. His analytical frameworks had been adopted throughout the federal government, and his persistence in the face of bureaucratic dismissal had prevented security failures with implications that extended far beyond government facilities to the infrastructure systems that supported modern civilization. The quiet recognition he received from colleagues who had initially dismissed his warnings reflected more than professional vindication. It represented institutional acknowledgement that protecting American security required analytical independence, bureaucratic courage, and willingness to act on intelligence assessments that challenged comfortable assumptions about the scope and sophistication of threats facing democratic societies in an increasingly complex global environment. Marcus Rivera sat in his office at the Strategic Threat Assessment Division, watching real-time intelligence feeds from infrastructure monitoring systems across America. The screens displayed patterns that would have been invisible to conventional analysis but were crystal clear through the frameworks he'd developed during his professional exile. New threats were emerging, more sophisticated, more patient, more dangerous than anything they'd confronted before. His secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from an asset in Eastern Europe. New players entering the game. Different methodology. Your patterns won't detect them. Marcus smiled grimly and opened a fresh threat assessment file. The adversaries were evolving, adapting to his analytical methods just as he predicted they would. But evolution worked both ways. The dismissed intelligence analyst who'd become America's last line of defense against invisible threats was already 3 steps ahead, developing new frameworks to identify enemies who thought they'd learned to hide from his pattern recognition outside his window. Millions of Americans went about their daily lives, completely unaware that their security depended on one man's ability to see threats that others refused to acknowledge. Marcus had learned that the greatest enemies weren't the ones who announced their presence. They were the ones who convinced you they didn't exist. He reached for his keyboard and began typing his next threat assessment, knowing that somewhere in the data streams flowing across his screens, the next invisible enemy was already making the subtle mistakes that would reveal their presence to someone trained to see what others missed. The game never ended. It just got more interesting. If this story of quiet competence, institutional courage, and the power of seeing what others miss resonated with you, it reflects a truth about our world. The most crucial battles are often fought by people whose names we never know, whose warnings we initially dismiss, and whose vigilance protects us from threats we can't imagine. Share your thoughts about unsung heroes in your own life in the comments below. Have you ever encountered someone whose expertise was dismissed only to be proven devastatingly right? What patterns do you notice that others seem to miss? Subscribe for more stories of individuals whose unconventional thinking and quiet persistence changed everything. The analysts, investigators, and observers whose refusal to accept comfortable assumptions saved lives and protected the things that matter most. Hit the notification bell so you never miss these powerful stories of competence triumphing over bureaucracy, truth over convenience, and individual courage over institutional inertia.